Save me a seat. 3 words. Spoken quietly, almost gently by a man Clara Whitmore had never seen before in her life. A tall stranger with trail dust on his coat and calm eyes that didn't flinch when he looked at her, not the way everyone else in Willow Creek looked at her. Not with disgust, not with pity, just direct. Like she was a person worth speaking to. Clara's breath caught. Around her the entire church had gone still. And then she saw it, the silver watch chain hanging from his vest. Her heart stopped cold. If this story already has you hooked, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end. I promise you, it's going to be one worth staying for. And drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The Sunday morning had started like every other Sunday morning for the past 3 years. Clara Whitmore woke before the sun, dressed in the same dark wool dress she wore every week, pinned her hair back without looking in the mirror for too long, and walked the half-mile to the white wooden church at the edge of Willow Creek's main road. She arrived early enough that the pews were still empty. She always did. Not because she was especially devout, though she was, but because she had learned painfully and slowly that arriving before everyone else meant she didn't have to walk past the staring faces, didn't have to feel the hush that fell over a conversation the moment she stepped into a room. She slipped into the third pew from the back left side, the same spot every week, far enough from the front that Reverend Grayson's eyes rarely found her. Far enough from the families with children that she couldn't hear the way mothers sometimes whispered to their daughters when Clara walked by. Close enough to the door that she could leave quickly once the service ended, before anyone felt the need to say something to her face that they'd already said behind her back 100 times. She sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. By the time the congregation filled in, Clara had learned to stop looking up. She kept her eyes on her Bible, on the worn pages her mother had pressed decades of prayers into. She listened to the sound of boots on wooden floors, the rustling of Sunday dresses, the low murmur of neighbors greeting one another warmly. She listened to all of it, and she let it wash past her like a river she was no longer allowed to stand in. Nobody sat beside her. Nobody had in 3 years. It wasn't spoken aloud. There was no rule posted on the church door that said Clara Whitmore was to be left alone in her pew. It didn't need to be. The people of Willow Creek, Montana Territory understood these things without being told. They understood the way a small town always does, through the slow accumulation of whispers, until the whispers became the truth, and the truth became a wall. And before long, the wall was so natural that nobody even remembered building it. The wall around Clara had gone up in the spring of 1881. That was when her fiancé, a charming cattle broker named Thomas Aldridge, had disappeared from Willow Creek in the middle of the night, 3 weeks before their wedding. He left behind an empty bank safe, 2 witnesses who swore they had seen Clara speaking privately with him in the hours before the robbery, and a town full of people who found it very convenient to have someone to blame. Clara had not helped him. She had not known. She had woken up that morning to a world that had already decided who she was, and nothing she said afterward changed a single mind. The law found no evidence against her. The marshal at the time said as much publicly at a town meeting she was not invited to attend. But in Willow Creek, the law's opinion and the town's opinion were 2 very different animals, and the town's opinion had longer teeth. So Clara rebuilt what she could. She moved back into her childhood home to care for her mother Edna, who had grown frail and slow on her feet since her husband passed. She took in sewing work. She sold eggs from the small flock of chickens she kept behind the house. She attended church every Sunday because her mother asked her to, because it mattered to Edna that her daughter not disappear from the world entirely, and because Clara Whitmore was underneath everything that had been done to her, too stubborn to give the people of Willow Creek the satisfaction of watching her vanish. She sat in the third pew from the back left side, and she endured. And then the door opened. She heard it, the way she heard everything now, carefully without looking. A heavier sound than the usual shuffle of Sunday morning feet. Boots that came down deliberately, not in a hurry, but not hesitating either. The low rustle of a coat being pushed back. A man's clearing of his throat. And then the voices around her dropped in a way they didn't usually drop at this point in the morning when people were still warming to each other and the news of the week. This silence had a different texture. The curious kind. The kind a whole room makes when something unexpected has walked into it. Clara looked up. He was standing in the aisle 4 feet away from her, and he was looking straight at her. Tall, broader through the shoulders than most men she knew, with the kind of weathered face that came from years outdoors. Not old 30 perhaps, or just past it. Dark hair pushed back from his forehead. A coat that was good quality, but had seen serious use trail dust, still visible at the hem. His hat was in his hands, held at his side the way a man holds something when he means to show respect, but hasn't been asked to. He was looking at her like she was simply a woman sitting in a church pew on a Sunday morning. Not like a scandal, not like a warning, just a woman. Save me a seat. 3 words. Low easy like he asked it every Sunday and expected a reasonable answer. Clara stared at him. Around her she was peripherally aware of the congregation doing the same. The stillness that had fallen over the room was complete now, the way a pond goes still when something unexpected breaks the surface. She could feel it without turning her head. Mrs. Hartwell, 2 pews ahead, had stopped mid-sentence. The Danforth brothers farmers, who never missed a chance to whisper something cutting in Clara's direction, had gone silent for the first time in living memory. Clara began. I'm new to Willow Creek, he said, still quietly, still in that unhurried voice. Rode in last night. Don't know anyone, and it seems like you've got room. There was a beat. Clara moved over 6 inches on the pew. He sat down beside her, settled his hat on his knee, and opened the hymnal that had been left on the pew without anyone picking it up in 3 years. The whispers started immediately. Clara heard them, the way she always heard them, as a low current running beneath the surface of the room, impossible to catch directly, but impossible to miss. She kept her eyes forward. Her hands were very still in her lap. She was aware with an acuity that bordered on pain of the warmth of the man sitting beside her, of the unfamiliar fact of another person occupying the 6 inches of space to her left that had been empty for so long it had become like a second skin. I'm Luke, he said in a murmur low enough that only she could hear it. Clara, she said. Nice to meet you, Clara. She didn't say anything else. She wasn't sure she could have, even if she'd known what to say. The service began. Reverend Grayson took the pulpit the way he always did, with the particular confidence of a man who had stood in that spot for 20 years and never once doubted his right to it. He was a handsome older man, silver-haired with a voice made for delivering absolutes. The congregation adored him. Half the town owed him favors in one form or another, a loan arranged at the right moment, a dispute mediated in someone's favor, a word put in on behalf of a son or daughter who needed a second chance. Reverend Samuel Grayson was the kind of man who collected gratitude the way some men collected land. He was 3 sentences into his opening scripture when his eyes found the 3rd pew from the back. Clara watched his expression do something she had never seen it do before, a flicker very brief, quickly controlled that she couldn't quite name. Not quite surprise, something older than surprise, something that passed over his face and was gone in less than a second, replaced immediately by the steady warmth he wore like a second face on Sundays. She told herself she'd imagined it. She told herself that for the rest of the service. The hymns came and went. Luke Callahan, as he gave his name, when an elder approached him afterward with the cautious, evaluating warmth of a man assessing a newcomer, turned out to have a pleasant baritone. He sang without self-consciousness. He listened to the sermon with his forearms on his knees, attentive, asking no unnecessary questions when spoken to, offering no information beyond the basics. New to the territory, looking for work, heard there was a horse operation outside town. By the time the closing prayers were said, Clara had the peculiar, unsettling sensation of having been treated for 90 minutes like a person who had done nothing wrong. It was more disorienting than the stairs. She was standing, reaching for her coat when she saw it. The watch chain. He had shifted slightly as he stood, and his coat had fallen open at the vest, and the chain was there, silver distinctive, with a small engraved link at the second clasp that caught the light in a way she had seen 1,000 times in the 3 years before Thomas Aldridge disappeared from her life. She had given Thomas that watch chain. A birthday gift the winter before everything fell apart. She had saved for 4 months to buy it. The world went very quiet around her. "Mr. Callahan." Her voice came out wrong, too flat, too careful. Luke turned. "Where did you get that watch chain?" His expression didn't change. Not exactly, but something behind his eyes shifted a stillness that was different from the easy calm he'd worn all morning. The stillness of a man who has been waiting for a specific question and has arrived at the moment it was asked. "That's a complicated answer," he said. "I'd like to hear it anyway. Not here." He glanced very briefly at the nearest cluster of congregation members who were already watching them with barely concealed attention. "Not in front of people who are going to make it into something it isn't." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She had spent 3 years learning to read the faces of people who wanted something from her, her silence, her departure, her shame. She was very good at it by now. This man did not want any of those things. She wasn't sure what he wanted, but it wasn't those things. "The road behind the livery," she said. "There's a break in the fence. Noon." She picked up her Bible and walked out of the church without looking back. She did not look at Mrs. Hartwell. She did not look at the Danforth brothers. She did not look at Reverend Grayson, who was shaking hands at the door with the particular warmth he reserved for Sundays. She walked straight past all of it, out into the gray November air, and she kept walking until she was around the corner and out of sight. Then she stopped, put one hand flat against the side wall of the building, and stood there for a full minute with her eyes closed. Her heart was slamming against her ribs. Her mind was doing what it always did when something happened that should not be happening. Running calculations, mapping angles, looking for the trick, the catch. The version of events that ended the way every other version had ended for 3 years, with Clara standing in the wreckage of something she'd allowed herself to believe might be real. She straightened up. She walked home. She sat with her mother through lunch and answered Edna's gentle questions about the service without mentioning the man or the watch chain, or the fact that she felt for the first time in 3 years like the ground under her feet had become uncertain in a way that was not entirely terrible. At noon, she went to the break in the fence behind the livery. He was already there. "Start talking," Clara said. Luke, she still thought of him as Luke, whatever his real name turned out to be, turned to face her with his hands loose at his sides and his hat off, and something about the posture told her this was not a man preparing to lie to her. "I found the watch chain in a trading post in Wyoming," he said. 6 months ago. The man who sold it told me he'd gotten it from a traveler who was moving east. Described him well enough that I knew who he'd been. Thomas. A man matching Thomas Aldridge's description, yes. He paused. "Clara, the man who sold me that chain said the traveler was in bad shape. Said he talked about going back for someone, a woman. Said the woman had nothing to do with what happened in Willow Creek." Clara did not move. "He said that. He said that. That's very convenient. I know how it sounds. Do you—" Her voice was still very flat, very careful, and she hated how well she had learned to keep it that way. "Because what it sounds like is a story that someone who wanted my trust would tell me. So I'd like you to tell me something else. I'd like you to tell me why you're really here. Because a cowboy looking for ranch work doesn't carry a stolen watch chain into a church and sit down next to the woman everyone in town blames for the robbery it came from. That's not a coincidence. That's a choice." The silence stretched for a full 10 seconds. "You're right," Luke said. "It was a choice." "Then tell me why." He looked at her steadily. "Because I've been looking into what happened at the Willow Creek Bank in 1881. And everything I've found points to the same conclusion, that you had nothing to do with it, and someone in this town has been very careful to make sure you stayed blamed for it." Clara felt something happen to her breathing. She controlled it. "Who are you?" she said. He held her gaze. "My name is Luke Callahan. That part's true. But I'm not here looking for ranch work." Then what are you here looking for? The truth about what happened to Thomas Aldridge. Because Thomas Aldridge didn't run away, Clara. His voice was quiet and completely certain. I think he was killed. And I think the man who killed him is still living very comfortably in this town. The wind came up between them cold and straight off the hills. Clara stared at him. That's a serious accusation. It's not an accusation yet, Luke said. It's a conclusion I've been building toward for 8 months, and I'm close to being able to prove it. But to prove it, I need something I haven't been able to find from the outside. What? I need someone who knew Thomas, who knew this town when it happened, who knows where the bodies are buried, figuratively speaking. He paused. Or maybe not. Clara let out a breath. 3 years. 3 years of sitting in the third pew from the back while people whispered past her. 3 years of carrying a blame she had never earned, watching it calcify into something permanent and unquestioned, watching the people who called themselves Christian allow a lie to define a woman's entire life, because it was easier than looking at the truth. You're asking me to help you, she said. I'm telling you what I found. What you do with it is up to you. She looked at him for a long time. The trading post in Wyoming, she said finally. The man who sold you the chain. What was his name? He went by Amos Webb. Did he say when? How long ago the traveler passed through? He said late summer 1881, 3 months after the robbery. Thomas disappeared in May. I know. He would have gone east. She heard her own voice working through it the way she had worked through it 1,000 times in the middle of sleepless nights and never gotten past a certain point. His family was east, Indiana. He had a brother. I checked. The brother hasn't seen him. Clara closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were dry. If Thomas is dead, she said, then someone made sure he couldn't come back, made sure he couldn't tell anyone what really happened. That's what I believe. And you think it's someone in this town? I think it's someone who had access to the bank, who had reason to want the money, and who had enough influence to make sure the blame landed on someone who couldn't fight back. His eyes didn't waver from hers. Someone with 30 years of goodwill in their pocket. Clara's mind went without her permission to the flicker she had seen cross Reverend Grayson's face this morning. That brief controlled something. The look of a man who had seen an unexpected piece appear on a board he thought he controlled. She said nothing about it. Not yet. I need to think, she said. Take the time you need. I'm not agreeing to anything. I understand. She turned to leave, stopped. Mr. Callahan. She didn't turn back around. If this is a game, if any part of this is something other than what you've said it is, I want you to know that I stopped having anything left to lose about 2 years ago. So whatever you think leverage over me looks like, you're wrong. A pause. Clara, he said quietly, I'm not here to hurt you. She walked back through the break in the fence and didn't let herself look back. But for the first time in 3 years, she did not walk straight home. She walked the long way past the creek, past the old mill, past the spots she had stopped allowing herself to visit, because being seen lingering anywhere other than her direct route between house and market and church had seemed for 3 years like asking for trouble. She walked the long way and let herself think in the way she'd forgotten she was allowed to think carefully, methodically, without the constant low drumbeat of managing other people's hatred. Thomas. Dead. Not gone, not hiding, not living some other life out east while she lived this one. Dead. She turned the word over slowly, looking at all its edges. She had grieved Thomas a long time ago, in the same quiet way she had grieved everything that had been taken from her with no audience and no ceremony. She had not been surprised when time eventually filed the sharpness off the grief and left something more like a scar than a wound. What she had never been able to grieve was the lie, the brand of it. The fact that she had been made to carry something that didn't belong to her, and the person who had put it on her had gone about his life while she carried it. If Luke Callahan was telling the truth, if Thomas had not abandoned her but had been silenced, then the lie had been deliberate. Not the casual cruelty of rumor, but something colder, something constructed. She stopped beside the creek and stood there for a long moment, listening to the water. Then she walked home, sat down at the kitchen table across from her mother, and said, "Mama, tell me everything you remember about the week before the bank robbery." Edna Whitmore looked at her daughter across the table with the particular look of a woman who had been waiting 3 years for someone to ask that question. "I was wondering when you'd come to that," Edna said, and began to talk. By the time night fell over Willow Creek, something had shifted in Clara's chest. Not certainty, not safety, not anything so clean as hope, but the particular restlessness of a woman who had been sitting still for 3 years and had just for the first time been given a reason to move. 3 blocks away in the room he'd taken above the feed store, Luke Callahan sat at a small writing desk and opened a notebook that was almost full. He turned to a fresh page. At the top he wrote 2 words, "She knows." Below that, after a moment's pause, he wrote 3 more, "She always did." He closed the notebook, reached into his inside coat pocket, pulled out something he hadn't shown Clara not yet. Couldn't yet. Not until he was sure she was ready for it. It wasn't just the watch chain he'd found in Wyoming, in the same trading post, in the same transaction with a man named Amos Webb. Luke had bought something else. Something small and folded and water-stained, pressed between the pages of a Bible the trader had thrown in as an afterthought. A note. 6 lines long in Thomas Aldridge's handwriting. The last 2 lines read, "Tell Clara it wasn't her fault. Tell her she needs to look at Grayson's land records from 1880. He's been stealing from all of us for years. She'll know what to do with it." Luke set the note on the desk. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked out the window at the dark street below, at the white steeple of the church visible against the night sky, and at the warm light burning in the window of a house 3 blocks east, where a woman was sitting up late asking her mother questions she should have been allowed to ask 3 years ago. He was going to have to tell her, all of it. He was just not yet sure whether when she knew everything, when she knew the part he hadn't told her, the part about where he'd been in the spring of 1881, and what he'd seen and what he hadn't done, there would be anything left in her eyes when she looked at him, except the same cold distance she gave everyone else. He was not sure he'd blame her if there wasn't. He turned the note face down on the desk and went to sleep. Outside, the wind moved through Willow Creek the way it always did, past the bank, past the church, past the pew that had sat empty for 3 years, and for the first time that morning, had not. Edna Whitmore had a memory like a locked chest, everything stored carefully, nothing thrown away, nothing shared, unless she believed the time was right. And apparently 3 years of watching her daughter carry a lie in silence had finally convinced her that the time was right. "The week before the robbery," Edna said, settling her hands around her teacup, the way she always did when she was preparing to say something she'd been holding on to for a long time. "Thomas came to this house twice. You were out both times. The second time he asked to wait for you, and I let him sit in the parlor. He was nervous. Not the ordinary kind of nervous a young man gets around his future mother-in-law." She paused. "The scared kind." Clara kept her voice level. "What did he say?" "He didn't say much directly. You know how Thomas was talked around things before he talked about them." A faint, complicated expression moved across Edna's face. "But he asked me something that stuck with me. Asked if I knew whether the church kept financial records separate from the town bank records, whether Reverend Grayson handled any of the church money himself, or if it went through the bank's main accounts." The air in the kitchen went very still. "He asked about Grayson," Clara said. "He asked about the church accounts, but yes, Grayson's name was in it." Edna looked at her daughter steadily. "I didn't know what to make of it then. Thomas was in banking, so I thought perhaps it was just professional curiosity. But after everything happened, after he disappeared, and they started saying what they said about you, I thought about those questions a great deal." "Why didn't you say anything?" The question came out sharper than Clara intended. Edna didn't flinch from it. "Because you were already drowning," Edna said quietly. "And because I had no proof. Just a scared young man asking questions about church money a week before the bank was robbed. That's not evidence, Clara. That's a story people could have twisted any direction they wanted, and most of them would have twisted it straight back at you. Clara sat with that for a moment. Her mother was not wrong. In the spring of 1881, with the whole town already looking for somewhere to put their outrage, anything Edna had said would have been dismissed as a grieving woman protecting her disgraced daughter. It would have made things worse. "What else?" Clara said. Edna hesitated in a way that was different from the earlier hesitation, smaller, more reluctant. "There was a man," Edna said. "I saw him from the window. He was waiting across the road while Thomas was inside. Just standing there. He left when Thomas left." She looked down at her teacup. "I've seen that man in church every Sunday for 30 years. He's one of Grayson's deacons. His name is Roy Sutton." Clara was up before she realized she'd moved, walking to the window that faced the dark street, her arms crossed over her chest, her mind running fast and cold. Roy Sutton was a small, dry-voiced man who sat in the front pew every Sunday and handed out hymnals and collected offering plates, and had, as far as anyone in Willow Creek knew, no inner life whatsoever beyond his devotion to the church and his cattle operation east of town. He had also been one of the two witnesses who told the marshal they had seen Clara speaking privately with Thomas the night of the robbery. Clara had known Roy Sutton her whole life. She had never trusted him without knowing exactly why. Now she thought she might know why. "Lock the door tonight, Mama," she said. "Don't let anyone in who isn't me." She was out of the house 10 minutes later. She didn't let herself think about whether what she was doing was wise. Wisdom had kept her sitting in that pew for 3 years, and it had not once made anything better. She walked 3 blocks in the cold night air and knocked twice on the door of the room above the feed store. Luke opened it so quickly she thought he might have been standing on the other side. "My mother saw one of Grayson's deacons watching Thomas the week before the robbery," Clara said without preamble. "Roy Sutton. He was one of the 2 witnesses who put me at the scene." Something moved behind Luke's eyes that she couldn't read. "Come in," he said. She stepped inside. The room was small and plain, with a writing desk against one wall and a travel bag that had seen considerable mileage. The notebook she'd seen him writing in back at the church was closed on the desk. Something else was on the desk beside it, face down. She noticed it without asking. "Roy Sutton," Luke said. He wasn't writing anything down, she noticed. He didn't need to. He already knew the name. "He's been Grayson's right hand for how long?" "As long as I can remember." "And the other witness? The second one who put you at the scene that night?" Clara had not thought about Margaret Hale in months. A deliberate, careful not thinking that she had maintained with some effort. Margaret had been her closest friend for most of her childhood. They'd grown up 3 houses apart, shared everything the way girls in small towns do, and then Margaret had stood up at a town meeting and calmly confirmed that yes, she had seen Clara and Thomas together the night of the robbery, speaking in a way that seemed secretive, in a way that suggested Clara knew what was about to happen. It had been the blow that ended Clara's ability to be surprised by anything. "Margaret Teller," Clara said. "She was Margaret Hale then. She married James Teller the following year." She kept her voice perfectly flat. "James Teller handles the books for 3 of Grayson's properties." Luke looked at her. "So both witnesses had direct ties to Grayson," he said. "I never put it together that cleanly before." She hated saying that. It felt like an accusation against herself. How had she spent 3 years not seeing the shape of it? But she knew the answer. When you were fighting to survive day to day, you didn't have the luxury of stepping back far enough to see the whole picture. Survival was a tunnel, and she had been in the tunnel. "That's not an accident," Luke said. "Those witnesses were chosen." "If that's true," Clara said, and her voice was very careful now, because what she was about to say had weight she needed to handle steadily. "Then this was never about Thomas running and me being caught in the middle. This was about making sure someone took the blame, specifically me." "Yes." "Why me specifically?" Luke was quiet for 2 seconds, which was a second and a half longer than she would have expected from a man who seemed to have answers to everything. "Because you were the one person Thomas might have told," he said. "You were his fiancée. If he'd found something and confided in you, You would have known enough to be dangerous. Framing you served two purposes. It gave the town someone to blame, and it ensured that anything you said about what you might have known or seen was immediately discredited. Clara absorbed that. Thomas found something, she said. About Grayson's land records, the bank records, something he wasn't supposed to find. I believe so. And you believe Grayson had him killed to keep him quiet. I believe someone did. Something in his tone on that last sentence, a particular controlled precision, made the back of her neck tighten. Mr. Callahan, she said, you're a very careful man with your words. I try to be. When you say you believe someone did, and you don't say Grayson did, is that because you're not certain yet? Or is it because there's something you know that you're managing how to tell me? The silence lasted long enough that it was its own answer. There's something I know, Luke said, that I'm not ready to tell you yet. Not because I'm trying to manipulate you. Because I need you to trust me enough first that when you hear it, you'll hear it clearly instead of through the lens of feeling deceived. That, Clara said, is not a reassuring thing to say. I know. I'm sorry. She looked at him for a long moment. A woman who had been lied to as comprehensively as Clara Whitmore had a particular skill set when it came to reading people, and what she read in Luke Callahan's face was not deception. It was something more complicated, something that looked from the outside a great deal like the expression of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had not yet found the right moment to set it down. Fine, she said. What do you need from me? I need to know how Grayson's land records are kept, who has access to them, whether there are copies anywhere outside his church office. Harold Briggs at the county recorder's office would have filed copies, Clara said immediately. He's 70 years old and has the memory of an accountant and the stubbornness of a mule. He keeps records the way other men keep grudges permanently and in good order. Can you get to Briggs without raising suspicion? I've been buying thread from his wife's dry goods store for 3 years. I can be there by Tuesday morning without it looking like anything other than Tuesday. Luke nodded. There's something else. I need to know, in the days before the robbery, did Thomas say anything to you? Anything that seemed odd afterward looking back? Clara was quiet. She had asked herself this question so many times that the memory had been worn smooth from handling. She turned it over again, carefully looking for edges she might have missed. He was distracted, she said slowly. I thought it was wedding nerves. He'd forget the middle of sentences. He'd stop talking and look out windows like he was waiting for something. She paused. 2 days before he disappeared, he told me he loved me in a way that felt like an ending. I told him he was being ridiculous, and he laughed and said I was right. She stopped. He wasn't being ridiculous. The words sat between them, without either of them touching them. He knew what was coming, Luke said. He must have. She heard her own voice saying it, and felt somewhere deep and insulated a grief that was new and old at the same time. New because she was finally naming it correctly. Old because it had been living inside her under a different name for 3 years. He knew something was going to happen, and he didn't tell me, either because he was trying to protect me, or because he was afraid of what I'd do with it. Probably both, Luke said. From everything I've learned about him, Thomas Aldridge was the kind of man who tried to carry things alone when he thought they were too dangerous for anyone else. Yes, Clara said simply. He was. Outside, a dog barked twice and went quiet. The wind moved along the eave of the building. Neither of them spoke for a moment, and it was not an uncomfortable silence, but the particular kind that settles between two people when they are both thinking hard about the same thing from different angles. Then Clara heard it. A footstep on the staircase. Not the natural creak of old wood settling a step. Deliberate. Then stopping. She and Luke both went still at the same instant, and the synchrony of it was so exact that she understood without discussion he had been listening for exactly this kind of sound. He moved to the side of the door without making a sound. She stayed exactly where she was without being told to. The footstep did not repeat. 30 seconds passed. A minute. The building settled around them in its ordinary nighttime way. Luke opened the door, the staircase was empty. But on the top step, where it would have been, stood on by someone listening at the door, the dust had been disturbed. A boot print, partial, pointing toward the room. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "How long have you been in this town?" Clara said. "Since Friday evening." "Someone already knows what you're looking for." It would appear so. She felt the cold slide of that understanding settle into her chest. Not panic, she had moved past the part of herself that panicked about things, but a hard, clear recognition. Whoever had arranged Thomas Aldridge's death and Clara Whitmore's destruction had done it carefully and successfully, and had been living safely with the results for 3 years. The arrival of a stranger who sat down beside the wrong woman in church and asked the wrong questions would not go unnoticed for long. "You need to be more careful about where you go during the day," Clara said. "Who you're seen talking to." "So do you." She almost said that she'd been nothing but careful for 3 years, and it had not protected her from a single thing, but she held that back. This was a different kind of careful. Not the defensive, apologetic careful of a woman trying not to provoke cruelty. The offensive kind. The kind where you watched your back because you were moving toward something instead of away from everything. She picked up her coat. Tuesday. Harold Briggs at the county recorder's. "I'll be at the horse ranch," Luke said. "They hired me this morning. Legitimate cover and a reason to be seen anywhere in a 10-mile radius." She paused at the door. The note on the desk was still face down, and she was still not asking about it, and she noticed that he was watching her, not ask about it with an expression she couldn't entirely decipher. "Whatever it is you're not ready to tell me yet," she said. "I want you to know that I've survived worse than a hard truth. Whatever it is, it won't break me." "I know," he said. Something in how he said it, not as a reassurance, but as a statement of fact, as though he already knew more about her than he had any reasonable way to know, made her stop half a second longer than she'd intended. She filed it away. Every small thing a man did when he was hiding something was data, and Clara had learned to collect data carefully. She went home. She slept, which surprised her, and dreamed of nothing which surprised her more. Monday morning came gray and cold, and with it the first thing left on Clara's porch. She found it when she opened the front door to bring in the morning milk, a single piece of paper folded once weighed down by a stone. She unfolded it. 4 words written in block letters that disguised the handwriting completely. "Leave Willow Creek now." She looked at it for a long moment. Turned it over. Nothing on the back. She folded it again, took it inside, put it in the bread box behind the flour tin, and went about making breakfast. Her mother came to the kitchen and asked if everything was all right, and Clara said yes, which was technically accurate in the sense that she was still standing and functional, and she let the question go at that. But she thought about that note all through Monday. Thought about the boot print on the stair. Thought about Luke and the face-down paper on his desk. By Tuesday morning, she was already at the county recorder's office before Harold Briggs had finished his first cup of coffee, and she had a very specific list of questions ready that had nothing to do with thread or dry goods. Harold was a small, precise man whose life's work was the organized preservation of other people's transactions, and he treated each record in his office with the devotion other men gave their children. He was also, crucially, one of the few people in Willow Creek who had never once treated Clara Whitmore with anything other than professional indifference, which in the economy of the past 3 years counted as extraordinary kindness. "Land records," Clara said carefully once Mrs. Briggs had gone to the back, "from 1879 through 1882. Specifically, any transfers or liens recorded under the name Grayson Samuel or Grayson-affiliated church properties." Harold looked at her over the rim of his spectacles for a beat longer than the question strictly required. "That's a specific range," he said. "I have specific questions." Another beat. "Give me 20 minutes, Harold said, and disappeared into the back room. He was gone 18 minutes. When he came back, he was carrying a record book that looked like it had been opened recently. The binding was stiff, but the pages turned easily, as though someone had been through them in the not-too-distant past. But he wasn't carrying it to her. He was carrying it to the shelf directly behind her, where he stood for a moment with his back to the room, and said in a very quiet, very even voice, without turning around, "There are 3 land parcels in this record that changed hands in 1881. All 3 were originally held under liens that came due at the same time. All 3 prior owners lost them within 90 days of the Willow Creek bank robbery. All 3 were transferred to a holding company. The holding company's registered agent is listed as one Roy S. Sutton." Clara's hands were very still on the counter. "The church got those parcels," she said. "The holding company got those parcels," Harold said, precisely still with his back turned, still in the same quiet voice. Whether the holding company and the church share anything in common is not a question that a county recorder is in a position to answer. He put the book back on the shelf, turned around, and returned to his desk. "Was there anything else I could help you with today, Miss Whitmore?" "No," Clara said. "Thank you, Harold." She walked out into the cold morning air and stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the recorder's office, and for a full 30 seconds she did not move. 3 families, 3 land parcels, 3 foreclosures timed perfectly with a bank robbery that left the bank's liquid funds depleted and its regular borrowers suddenly in default. And Roy Sutton's name on the receiving end of all of it, clean as a ledger entry, quiet as a funeral. The robbery hadn't just been about stealing money. It had been about triggering defaults on loans the church held against those properties. The money was a cover. The land was the point. And Thomas had figured it out. She was halfway back to her house when she heard footsteps catching up behind her, and every instinct she had gone hard and alert before she could decide whether to be afraid. She turned. It was Margaret Teller. Clara had not spoken to Margaret in 2 years. Not since the last time she'd tried, and Margaret had turned away without a word, which had been painful enough that Clara had stopped trying after that. But Margaret was here now in the middle of a Tuesday morning, on a street that neither of them had particular reason to be on, looking at Clara with an expression that was doing several things at once: fear, guilt, determination, and that made Clara's chest tighten before a word was spoken. "I need to talk to you," Margaret said. Low, urgent. Not like a woman who had chosen a comfortable lie, like a woman who had been living with an uncomfortable one. "Then talk," Clara said. Margaret looked over her shoulder, then back. "Roy Sutton came to my husband last year," she said rapidly, her words pressed flat by nerves. "He told James that if we ever said anything different from what we'd testified, if either of us changed our story about what we saw that night, he had evidence that James had mishandled funds at the Teller property before we were married. Evidence he said he would take to the marshal." She stopped. There was no such evidence. James had done nothing wrong. But Roy had the kind of people behind him who could manufacture evidence as well as destroy it. "And we have 2 children, Clara. We have 2 children, and I—" Her voice cracked once precisely, and she stopped it. "I am so sorry. I have been sorry every day." Clara looked at her. This woman had been her closest friend, had stood up in front of an entire town and confirmed a lie about her, had watched Clara's life be dismantled piece by piece, and had remained silent for 3 years under threat, and was standing here now, shaking because something had changed, because something had shifted in the careful architecture of fear that had kept her silent, and she was risking the threat of Roy Sutton and whatever was behind him to stand on a public street and say out loud to Clara's face, "I am sorry." Clara was quiet for a long moment. "What changed?" she said. "The stranger," Margaret said. "The man who sat with you Sunday. Roy Sutton was at our house last night asking James if we knew anything about who he was or why he was in town." She swallowed. "He was scared, Clara. I have never seen Roy Sutton scared before. And I thought if someone is scaring Roy Sutton, maybe things are finally moving. Maybe it's not too late." Clara looked at her. "It might not be too late," she said carefully. "But I need you to be prepared for the possibility that being prepared to speak the truth is going to cost you something. Not as much as it cost me, but something." "I know," Margaret said. "Are you prepared for that?" A pause, shorter than Clara expected. "Yes," Margaret said. Clara nodded once. "Go home," she said. "Act normally. Don't approach me again publicly and don't talk to the stranger. If I need you, I'll find a way to reach you that doesn't involve Roy Sutton's eyes." Margaret nodded. She looked like she wanted to say more. The words were visible in her face, the ones she'd been holding for 3 years, but she held them. She turned and walked away. Clara watched her go. 3 years. 3 years, Margaret Teller had carried that apology in silence, locked in place by fear and by the very machinery that had destroyed Clara's life. And she had come forward now, trembling and overdue, because a stranger with a calm voice had sat down in the wrong pew on a Sunday morning and frightened the wrong people. Something was shifting in Willow Creek. Clara could feel it the way you feel a weather change in your bones before it's visible in the sky. She walked directly to the horse ranch east of town. Luke was in the paddock when she arrived, and he read her face before she'd said a word, and he said, "Come away from the fence." And they walked until they were well out of earshot of anyone. And then Clara told him everything. Harold Briggs' the land records, Roy Sutton's name on the holding company, and Margaret Teller shaking on a public street with 3 years of guilt finally overflowing its container. Luke listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "3 families lost their land," he said, "and nobody connected it to the robbery. Because the robbery looked like simple theft. Nobody looked for the liens that defaulted." "Somebody did," Luke said. She looked at him. "Thomas did," he said. The weight of it settled between them. "He was going to take it to the marshal," Clara said. "He never got the chance." "No." Her voice was flat and clear. "He didn't." She looked at Luke steadily, at this man who had ridden into Willow Creek with a dead man's watch chain and a notebook full of the kind of careful, methodical investigation that took months. At the face-down note on his desk that she still hadn't asked about. At the careful way he measured everything he said to her, not in the way of a man who was lying, but in the way of a man who was afraid of what the truth was going to cost him. "Luke," she said. "Clara, tell me what's on that paper you keep face down on your desk." The wind moved between them. He looked at her for a long time. She watched him make the decision. Watched it happen in his face the way a man puts down something heavy he's been carrying too long because his arms have finally given out. "It's a note," he said, "from Thomas." Clara did not move. "I found it with the watch chain," he said. "I should have told you Sunday. I told myself I was waiting for the right time, but the truth is, I was afraid of what it would do to you, and I was wrong to make that choice for you." He held her gaze. "He wrote it near the end. He thought he was going to die. He asked whoever found it to tell you it wasn't your fault. He said you needed to look at Grayson's land records from 1880. He paused. And he said you'd know what to do with it." The world was very quiet. Somewhere in the distance a horse shifted in its stall. Clara stood completely still for a long time. Then she turned her face away from him just briefly. And the thing that passed over her was private and complete. And when she turned back, her eyes were dry, and her voice was steady. And whatever she had needed to do with that moment, she had done it in those 3 seconds. "He was right," she said. "He was right about a lot of things," Luke said quietly. "He was right that I'd know what to do with it." She straightened. "We're going to need that note. We're going to need Harold Briggs's records. We're going to need Margaret Teller. And we're going to need to move before Roy Sutton figures out exactly how close we are." "That may be sooner than we'd like," Luke said. "I know." She met his eyes. "What haven't you told me yet?" A long beat. "The man I really am," Luke said, "is more complicated than I've let on. And what I was doing in Montana Territory in the spring of 1881, where I was, what I saw you need to know before this goes any further. Because when it comes out, and it will come out, I don't want you blindsided." Clara looked at him. This man with his careful words and his face-down notes and his guilt, he carried the way Thomas had carried his, alone in silence, waiting for the right moment that never came on its own. "Tell me," she said. And this time he did. His real name was Nathan Hale. He said it plainly without preamble, the way a man says something he has been rehearsing and has finally decided that rehearsing it any longer is just another form of delay. Clara repeated it once quietly, the way you repeat a word in a foreign language to make sure you've heard the sound of it correctly. "Deputy Marshal Nathan Hale," he said. "Federal Circuit based out of Cheyenne. I've been working a land fraud case tied to this territory for the better part of 2 years. The bank robbery in Willow Creek was one piece of a larger pattern. Grayson had done versions of the same thing in 2 other towns before this one. Smaller scale, different instruments, but the same structure. Create a crisis trigger. The defaults absorb the properties through a cutout." He paused. "I came to Willow Creek 8 months ago with the watch chain and Thomas's note, and enough circumstantial evidence to know something happened here. Not enough to prove it in any court." Clara was listening with the particular quality of stillness she had, the kind that meant she was processing hard, not shutting down. "You said there was something else," she said. "Something about the spring of 1881. Where you were." Nathan looked at her directly. "I was in Willow Creek," he said. "Not as a marshal. I was 24 years old and I was riding with a small outfit that was passing through. We stopped for 2 days. I was in the saloon the night Thomas Aldridge was killed." The word landed. Killed. Not disappeared. Not ran. Killed. Clara held very still. "I didn't know who he was," Nathan said. "I didn't know anything about the bank or the robbery which had happened the night before. I just saw 2 men drag a third man out the back door. One of them was Roy Sutton. The other I didn't recognize then." He stopped. "I recognize him now. It was Grayson's older son, Daniel." "You saw it happen," Clara said. "I saw the beginning of it. I followed them as far as the alley." His jaw tightened in a way he couldn't entirely control. "There were 4 of them waiting. I was 24 years old, and armed with a knife and a pistol that had seen better days, and I told myself I needed more information before I did anything, that it might not be what it looked like." He stopped again. "It was exactly what it looked like. I heard enough, and then I walked away." The silence between them had weight. "You walked away," Clara said. "Yes." "And Thomas died." "Yes." She turned her face away from him, looked at nothing for a moment. He let her without filling the silence, which told her something about him, that he understood the difference between a silence that needed to be filled and one that needed to be left alone. "You've been carrying that," she said finally, still not looking at him, "for 5 years. And the case. The 2 years you've spent building it." She turned back. "Is this about justice, or is this about penance?" It was a precise question, and he didn't dodge it. "Both," he said. "I know that's not a clean answer." "No," she said. "But it's an honest one." She looked at him for a long time. "You were 24 years old and badly outnumbered, and you made a terrible choice. You didn't create the situation, and you didn't pull any trigger. I'm not going to stand here and tell you what you should have done because I wasn't there." She paused. "But I need you to understand something. The reason I can work with you, the reason I'm still standing here, is because I believe you're telling me the truth. All of it, not just the pieces that make you look like the right person for this. If at any point I find out there's another piece you held back, we're done. Are we clear?" "We're clear," Nathan said. "Good." She straightened. "Then let's talk about what we do next." The plan, such as it was, had 3 moving parts. Nathan needed official documentation connecting Grayson directly to the holding company that had received the foreclosed properties. Roy Sutton's name was on the registration, but Sutton was an instrument, not the architect, and a good lawyer could separate them if it came to court. Harold Briggs had the land records, but land records alone showed a transfer, not a conspiracy. What they needed was the financial thread, the account that received the stolen bank funds, which Nathan believed had been routed through the church's operating accounts and then dispersed as property purchases over the following 18 months. That meant someone needed to get inside the church's financial records. "Grayson keeps the church accounts in his office," Clara said. "Has done for 20 years. He's never let a deacon or treasurer handle them directly. Everyone always thought it was because he was particularly conscientious. She said the word with the precise weight it deserved. He hosts a social the third Thursday of every month for the church women. Ladies' Fellowship, he calls it. My mother used to attend before she got sick. Grayson uses the fellowship hall, which is the attached building. His main office is in the church itself, which is locked during the social, but not watched. Everyone's in the hall. Nathan looked at her. "You're not suggesting what I think you're suggesting," he said. "His office window faces the back alley," Clara said. "The latch has been broken since 1879 because he's too careful with church funds to spend money on a carpenter." She kept her voice perfectly level. "I know this because I fixed that window for him twice myself with my father before my father died. And both times, Grayson thanked my father and never got it properly repaired." "Clara, don't," she said. "Don't give me the speech about danger. I have been in danger since the spring of 1881, and most of it has been of the slow, suffocating variety, which is far worse than the kind that at least moves quickly." She met his eyes. "Thursday is 4 days away. What else do you need?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Back up," he said. "I can't go in without someone watching the exterior. And it can't be you. You'd be recognized, and it would confirm every suspicion Sutton already has." "Then who?" "There's a man at the ranch. Older hand, been here since before the robbery. Name's Pete Garland. He's not connected to Grayson, and he has no reason to be loyal to him. I've been taking his measure for a week." Nathan paused. "He knew Thomas. Said so on my second day there, unprompted. Said Thomas used to ride out to buy horses and always had a fair word for the stable hands." "Pete Garland," Clara said. She searched her memory. "He had a lien on that piece of land east of the creek. Lost it in 1881. Nathan looked at her sharply. "He was one of the 3 families," he said. "I didn't recognize the name until just now. But yes." She felt something steady and cold lock into place in her chest. "He lost that land, and he's been working someone else's ranch ever since. If he knew Thomas and he lost his land in the same season, he's been living next to the man who took everything from him without knowing it." Nathan turned away from her briefly and made a sound that was not quite a word. "I'll talk to him tonight," he said, carefully. "Very." She was almost gone when he said her name. She stopped, turned halfway. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the 5 years, for Thomas, for what you've been living with, because I didn't do what I should have done in that alley." He said it without decoration, without the hedging language of a man who was hoping the apology would do more than it could. Just the words direct, offered without expectation. Clara looked at him. "I know," she said. She went home. She lay awake until well past midnight, and in the dark, she did the thing she had been putting off since Sunday morning. She let herself feel the full shape of what she now knew. Thomas hadn't left her. He'd been trying to protect her when they killed him. He'd died with her name in his thoughts, asking whoever found his note to tell her she wasn't to blame. 3 years she had carried the weight of thinking somewhere beneath the anger and the pride and the careful management of daily survival that she must have done something. Said something. Trusted the wrong person, or shown him some reason to believe she couldn't be trusted with the truth. He hadn't left her. He'd died. It was a worse truth and a better one at the same time, and she cried for it once thoroughly in the dark where no one could see, and then she stopped and slept. Wednesday passed quietly. Thursday morning came with a hard frost, and the particular smell of November that Clara had always associated with her mother's cough getting worse, and the chickens being uncooperative, and the kind of stubborn, ordinary domestic misery that she had lately been allowing herself to appreciate as a form of stability. She spent the morning in complete normalcy, visible and unremarkable. She walked to the general store. She bought flour. She spoke to Mrs. Emmett about the weather in the flat, pleasant way she had learned to speak to people she neither trusted nor hated. And Mrs. Emmett spoke back in the same flat, pleasant way, and neither of them said anything of any significance, and Clara counted this as a successful morning. She was back at her house by noon, sitting with her mother, when the knock came. 3 times. Deliberate. Not the loose-knuckled knock of a neighbor. Clara opened the door. Roy Sutton was standing on her porch. In the years she had known him, Roy Sutton had always managed to look like a man who was doing you a favor simply by being present. He had the bearing of someone to whom small cruelties were a form of relaxation, not dramatic cruelties, not the kind that left marks. The quiet, administrative kind. The kind that came wrapped in reasonable language and left you wondering afterward whether you'd imagined it. He was smiling at her now in exactly that way. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I hope I'm not interrupting. What do you want, Roy?" The smile didn't move. "I wanted to stop by as a concerned member of the congregation. There's been some talk, as I'm sure you're aware, about the new ranch hand, the one who sat with you Sunday. People are worried." "People are always worried about something," Clara said. "I find it rarely has much to do with me. In this case, I think it does." He tilted his head. "The man has been asking questions around town. Questions about the old bank situation, about land records." He paused, watching her face. "I'm sure you can understand why that might make people nervous. Old wounds, you know. The town has worked hard to put that unpleasantness behind us." "Has it?" Clara said. "We all have." The smile was still there, but something had shifted behind it, something harder. "I'd hate for anyone to stir things up unnecessarily, particularly at a time when your mother's health is delicate." He let the pause land. "It would be a shame if the added stress affected her recovery." Clara looked at him. The threat was perfectly constructed, perfectly deniable. Stress. Recovery. No fingerprints on it. "Thank you for your concern," she said. "I'll pass your regards to my mother." She closed the door. She stood on the other side of it for exactly 4 seconds, her hand still on the latch, breathing steadily through her nose. Then she went to the kitchen, told her mother she had an errand to run before dark, and left through the back door. She did not go to Nathan directly. She went to Margaret Teller's house, went around to the kitchen entrance, and knocked twice softly. Margaret answered within seconds, like she'd been expecting it, like she'd been sitting near the door. "Sutton came to my house," Clara said low and quick. "He mentioned my mother. He knows we're moving on something." Margaret's face went pale. "He came to James this morning too. Told him the ledger matter from before, said the evidence was real and he'd use it if James said anything to anyone about anything." She swallowed hard. "James is scared, Clara. He's really scared." "I know." Clara kept her voice level, kept the fear out of it, because fear was contagious and she needed Margaret functional. "Listen to me. Tonight, Sutton and Grayson are going to be occupied with the Ladies' Fellowship. I need you to make sure James stays home and says nothing to no one until I come to you. Can you do that?" "Yes. If anything happens tonight, if anyone comes to your door who isn't me, you tell James you were in bed all evening and you know nothing." She looked at Margaret directly. "I need to be able to trust you." "You can," Margaret said. The words came out quiet and certain, in a way that 3 years ago Clara would have believed without question, and now had to measure against everything that had happened since. She measured them. She decided she believed them. "Good," she said, and left. Thursday evening, the Ladies' Fellowship convened as scheduled in the church hall, and Reverend Grayson presided over it with his particular Sunday warmth, and 30 women sat in the warm room and drank tea and discussed charitable works for the winter season. Across the back alley, 2 men moved in the dark. Nathan had been inside Grayson's office for 11 minutes when Pete Garland tapped 3 times on the window frame to signal clear. Nathan worked by the light of a small lantern kept low, his hands moving through the file drawers with the practiced speed of a man who knew what he was looking for. Church accounts, monthly ledgers, property fund disbursements. He found them in the 3rd drawer. The records went back to 1879. Nathan photographed nothing. He had no camera, but he had a memory built for this kind of work, honed by 2 years of exactly this kind of quiet evidence gathering, in rooms where he was not supposed to be. He read fast, tracked the numbers forward in time, followed the thread of a particular account that was listed as Property Maintenance and Community Development Fund, and which had in the 18 months following the bank robbery received and disbursed an amount of money that had no business being in a church account. And then he found the name. Not Sutton, not Grayson, not directly. A name he did not recognize. A woman's name. Eliza R. Calloway. Listed as the receiving party for 3 separate property fund transfers, each one corresponding almost exactly to the assessed value of the 3 foreclosed parcels. He read it twice to be sure. Then Pete Garland tapped twice on the window frame, not the 3-tap clear signal. 2 taps. Someone was coming. Nathan had the drawer closed and the lantern dark in 4 seconds. He was out the window in 6. He pressed flat against the exterior wall beside Pete and did not breathe for 30 seconds while footsteps moved along the far end of the alley, paused, moved again, and eventually faded. They waited 2 full minutes. Then Pete said very quietly, "That was Daniel Grayson, the son. He walks that alley every Thursday night during the fellowship, checks the church is locked." Pete's voice was the voice of a man who had watched the patterns of this town for a long time without anyone noticing he was watching. "Has done it for 2 years. Nathan filed that. "You knew about the alley." "I know a lot of things," Pete said. "About this town. About what was taken from people who couldn't get it back." He paused in the darkness. "I lost my land to a holding company in 1881. I've been trying to figure out who that holding company answered to ever since." "Roy Sutton registered it," Nathan said. A long silence. "Sutton," Pete said. The name came out with the particular flatness of a man who has just had a suspicion he'd been carrying for years, confirmed in 2 syllables. "Sutton was the front," Nathan said. "Grayson is the back, and there's a name inside those records that I haven't placed yet. A woman named Eliza Calloway. Mean anything to you?" Pete was quiet for a moment. "Grayson had a sister," he said slowly. "Married name was Calloway. She moved east about 15 years ago. Reverend always said they were estranged." Nathan looked at him in the dark. Grayson had never been estranged from his sister. He had been sending her money through the church accounts, laundered through property transfers for years, and she had been holding it far enough away to be untouchable, close enough in blood to be trusted completely. The scheme was more sophisticated than Nathan had understood. This wasn't just land fraud. This was a long-running, carefully designed financial operation, using the church as its engine, using the bank robbery as the trigger, and using the territory's distance from federal oversight as its shelter. And it had been running quietly and profitably, while Clara Whitmore sat alone in a pew every Sunday and endured the consequences of being its most convenient scapegoat. He walked back to the feed store through the dark in a state of cold, controlled fury that he had learned over 2 years to make useful. Clara was waiting at the top of the stairs. He had told her to stay home. She had evidently considered that suggestion and declined it. "What did you find?" she said. He told her. All of it, the accounts, the transfers, Eliza Calloway, the layered structure of it. He watched her take it in, with that quality of stillness that he had come to understand was not emotional distance, but its opposite. Clara. Whitmore felt things very deeply and moved through them without letting them move her sideways, which was a form of strength he had rarely seen in anyone. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "His sister," she said. "Living in St. Louis, I expect. Untouched. Unreachable with what we currently have." "What do you need to reach her?" "A federal warrant, which requires a federal judge, which requires enough evidence to convince a judge that what I have isn't circumstantial." He paused. "The land records from Briggs, Thomas's note, Margaret Teller's testimony about the witness intimidation, and ideally one of Grayson's own people willing to talk." Clara looked at him. "Pete Garland," she said. "He lost his land. He has every reason. He's not the one I'm thinking of." She was quiet for a moment. "Roy Sutton is scared. You said it yourself. Margaret said he came to her husband frightened. A scared man who knows he's the front of an operation being investigated is a man who has to decide very quickly whether he'd rather be charged alongside Grayson or alongside the federal marshal who has been quietly building a case for 8 months." Nathan looked at her. "You want to approach Sutton," he said. "I want you to approach Sutton," she said, "with the exact information you have, the holding company, his name on the registration, Eliza Calloway. You give him a clear picture of exactly how much you know and exactly what the consequences are for the front man when the back man decides to protect himself. She held his gaze. A man like Sutton didn't get where he is by being loyal to anything except his own continued comfort. Give him a better option than Grayson can offer and see what he does. The silence stretched. That's a significant risk, Nathan said. If Sutton goes straight to Grayson, then Grayson knows we're close and makes a move, Clara said, which means he moves out into the open where we can see him instead of staying comfortable and invisible and doing things to my porch and my mother's medicine supply. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. He already knows we're close, Nathan. Sutton came to my house today. Whatever advantage we had in moving quietly is gone. Now it's a question of whether we move first. He looked at her for a long time. The woman who had spent 3 years sitting alone in a church pew, head down, enduring, was in this room in the sense that her history was in her face and her voice and the precise, measured way she moved through every conversation. But the woman in front of him now was not that woman in any other sense. This woman had been given a reason to move, and she had moved straight at the center of everything with no hesitation and no wasted steps. Thomas had been right. She would know what to do with it. I'll approach Sutton tomorrow morning, Nathan said. Good. She picked up her coat. And Nathan. She stopped at the door. Whatever Sutton says, whatever he tells you about that night about Thomas, I want to hear it. Firsthand. No filtering, no deciding what I can handle. I've handled everything else. I know you have, he said. She left. Nathan sat down at the desk and opened the notebook and wrote for 20 minutes. Everything from the church office, every number, every name, the full structure of Grayson's operation as he now understood it. He wrote it fast and clean, the way you write, when you know that time is no longer your ally. When he finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling. There was one thing he hadn't told Clara yet. One piece he was still holding, not because he was trying to protect her, but because he hadn't fully understood it himself until tonight, when Pete Garland had said the word estranged in the dark alley, and Nathan had felt something click into place. Grayson's operation had a timeline. It had started in 1879, which was the year Nathan's office had first recorded a complaint about land irregularities in this territory. Somewhere in the Federal Circuit records, there was a complaint filed by a young bank employee in Willow Creek who had noticed inconsistencies in certain church-adjacent accounts. The complaint had been filed and then quietly buried. Someone had reached inside the Marshall Circuit and made it disappear. Nathan had known this for months. What he had not known until tonight, what the date on Eliza Calloway's first receiving transfer had just told him, was the timing. The complaint had been buried 3 weeks before the bank robbery. 3 weeks before Thomas Aldridge died, which meant that before Roy Sutton was watching Thomas from across the street, before Margaret Hale was being coerced into false testimony, before any of the machinery of Willow Creek's conspiracy had moved, Grayson had already reached inside the Federal Circuit and neutralized the one official channel Thomas might have used to report what he'd found. Someone inside Nathan's own organization had helped cover this up. He sat with that for a long time. Then he closed the notebook, put the face-down note from Thomas in his inside coat pocket, and went to bed, because tomorrow was going to require everything he had, and sleep was not a luxury anymore. Outside Willow Creek was dark and quiet, but somewhere in that darkness, Roy Sutton was awake. Nathan could feel it the way you feel whether that particular shift in the air that meant something was about to break in one direction or another, and the only question was which direction you were standing when it did. Roy Sutton was hitching his horse outside the feed store at 7:30 in the morning when Nathan fell into step beside him. "Don't look around," Nathan said quietly. "Don't change what you're doing. Just listen." Sutton's hands went still on the harness for exactly 1 second before resuming. The man had nerves. Nathan gave him that. "I know about the holding company," Nathan said. "I know your name is on the registration. I know the 3 properties, the timeline, the transfers to Eliza Calloway in St. Louis. I know about Daniel Grayson in that alley in 1881. He kept his voice level, kept walking at a pace that looked like two men passing on a busy morning. I also know that a federal complaint filed by Thomas Aldridge was buried inside the Marshal's circuit 3 weeks before he died, which means someone with reach inside that circuit is connected to Samuel Grayson. Sutton said nothing. His jaw was very tight. Here is what's going to happen, Nathan said. The evidence I have goes to a federal judge within the week. When it does, Grayson's first move will be to separate himself from the instrument. You know what that means. You're the registered name on every paper trail. You're the one who will stand in front of a court while Grayson sits in his church and mourns that a trusted deacon deceived him for years. Sutton stopped walking. What do you want? He said. Low, flat, the voice of a man who has done this kind of calculation before. I want Grayson, Nathan said. I want the name inside the federal circuit, and I want a signed statement detailing every transaction, every order you received, and what you personally witnessed the night Thomas Aldridge was killed. Sutton turned and looked at him for the first time. The fear in his face was genuine, but underneath it was something Nathan recognized, the particular arithmetic of a self-preserving man running numbers in real time. If I give you all that, Sutton said, what happens to me? That depends on the judge. But a cooperative witness who comes forward voluntarily with complete information is a substantially different legal position than the man whose name is on every document when the case breaks without him. Nathan held his gaze. I'm giving you one opportunity. Today. If I have to build the case around you, instead of with you, I will, and you will not like where you end up. Sutton looked at him for a long moment. Give me until sundown, he said. You have until noon. Sutton's nostrils flared. That's not enough time. It's all the time you have, Nathan said, and walked away. He did not look back. Looking back was the kind of thing that told a man he was worried, and he could not afford to look worried right now. He walked directly to the livery, saddled his horse, and rode out to the ranch at a pace that looked like a man going to work. His hands were steady. His mind was not. The federal circuit. Someone inside the federal circuit had reached into an active complaint and made it disappear before Thomas could be protected. That meant someone with access to filing records with enough authority to pull a document without triggering a question. A deputy, a clerk, a circuit judge, or, and this was the possibility that had kept Nathan awake until past 2 in the morning, a marshal. He had not told Clara this part yet. He was not sure how to tell her that the institution he represented might have its own rot in it, that the corruption in Willow Creek had roots long enough to reach Cheyenne. He was still turning it when Pete Garland met him at the paddock fence with an expression that said the morning had already gone sideways. Daniel Grayson was at the ranch before sunup, Pete said, asking questions about you. Who you'd talked to, whether you'd been off the property any evenings. What did you say? Said you were a good hand kept to yourself, hadn't noticed anything unusual. Pete's voice was dry. He wasn't satisfied, but he didn't push. Man like that doesn't push directly. He circles. He'll go to his father. Already did I expect. Pete leaned on the fence rail. Nathan, how close are we? Close enough that Sutton's deciding right now whether to save himself. Far enough that if anything breaks wrong in the next 12 hours, we lose the window. Pete was quiet for a moment. What do you need from me? I need you to stay visible and ordinary for the rest of the day. If anyone asks, I've been a reliable ranch hand all week, and you've got no reason to think otherwise. Nathan paused. And I need you to be prepared to give a sworn statement about your land parcel. The foreclosure, the holding company, everything you know. I've been prepared to do that for 3 years, Pete said. Just needed someone to ask. Nathan rode back to town at noon exactly. Sutton was waiting at the edge of the creek path alone, hat in his hands, looking like a man who had aged 5 years since morning. Nathan pulled up beside him and waited. Grayson gave the order, Sutton said without any preamble this time. The decision had been made somewhere between 7:30 and noon, and the man had come out the other side of it with a kind of flat determination that Nathan recognized the look of someone who had burned one bridge and was standing on the remaining ground. I was there when he gave it. In his office the night before the robbery, he told Daniel and 2 hired men that Thomas Aldridge had found the account irregularities and was planning to report them. He said it needed to be handled before morning. Those are his words. Handled. Those are his words. And you were present. I was present. Did you participate? Sutton's jaw worked. I arranged for the 2 hired men. I didn't go to the alley. A pause. That's the truth. It was probably the truth. Nathan filed it without comment. The federal complaint, Nathan said. The one Thomas filed. How did it get buried? Sutton looked at him. Grayson has a brother-in-law, he said. William Marsh. He's a circuit clerk in the Cheyenne office. Has been for 12 years. Nathan felt something settle into place with the particular certainty of a key turning in a lock. Not a marshal, a clerk. William Marsh, Eliza Calloway's husband, who had received the property fund money through his wife's account and who had in exchange made one federal complaint disappear into the bottom of a filing drawer where it had sat for 5 years. Family. The whole operation had been run through family. Grayson at the center, his sister holding the money in St. Louis, her husband providing federal cover in Cheyenne. Roy Sutton and Daniel Grayson as the instruments on the ground. Every piece connected by blood or debt or both. Will you put all of this in a signed statement? Nathan said. Yes. Today. Yes. Sutton looked at him steadily. I want it on record that I came forward voluntarily. I want it on record that I was coerced into my original witness statement in 1881 and that I have been operating under ongoing threat. Were you coerced? A long pause. Not initially, Sutton said. Initially, I believed Grayson when he said it was necessary. By the time I understood the full scope of what I'd participated in, there was no safe way out. He looked away. I am not asking for your sympathy. I'm telling you the facts as they are. Nathan handed him a piece of paper and a pencil. Write down everything you just told me, he said. Dates, names, amounts, conversations. Everything. I'll come to your house tonight for the formal statement. Sutton took the paper. You should know, he said, not looking up from the paper, that Grayson is planning something for Sunday service. Daniel came home last night, and they had a long meeting. I don't know exactly what was said, but I know the shape of it. He knows you've been asking questions. He's going to move to control the narrative before you can. What does that mean? What would he do? What he always does, Sutton said. He'll stand at that pulpit and tell the story first. He'll make you the villain outside agitator coming in to disturb a community that has already healed from its troubles. He'll tie it to Clara, make her look like she brought trouble deliberately. By the time Sunday service is over, this town will be so firmly behind him that anything you try to bring forward will look like an attack on the community itself. Nathan looked at the back of Sutton's bent head. Then we don't give him Sunday, Nathan said. He rode hard back toward town, mind moving faster than his horse. If Grayson acted Sunday, he needed the warrant in hand before then. Which meant getting Sutton's statement tonight, getting the documents from Briggs in the morning, and finding a way to reach a federal judge in under 48 hours, which normally would have taken 2 weeks, but which, given that the circuit clerk in Cheyenne was now a named co-conspirator, needed to go through a different channel entirely. He was still running the logistics when he turned onto Clara's street and saw the smoke. It was coming from behind her house. Not a fire, not yet, but a column of thick smoke that meant something was burning hard and fast and recently started. He pushed his horse into a full run. He was off the horse before it had fully stopped through the side gate into the back where the small chicken coop and the woodpile stood. The woodpile was burning. Someone had soaked it with something the fire was too uniform, too immediate for accident. Clara was already out there with a bucket, her coat pulled over her house dress, working with the focused efficiency of a woman who understood that there was no time for panic and had dispensed with it accordingly. Nathan took the second bucket from the hook beside the water barrel and worked beside her without a word between them for 4 solid minutes until the fire was down to smoldering. Then they both stopped. Clara's face was flushed from the heat, her hair half undone from the effort, and she was looking at the blackened woodpile with an expression that was not fear or even anger, but something harder. the expression of a woman whose patience for being targeted has just crossed a line. "Third time," she said. "First the note. Then Mama's medicine went missing from the shelf Tuesday morning, which I didn't mention because I didn't want to worry you. Now this." Nathan looked at her. "The medicine. I replaced it the same day. Mama doesn't know." She set down her bucket. "This is Grayson sending a message. Not Sutton. Sutton is scared. This is Grayson himself or Daniel making sure I understand what's at stake if I keep moving. It means he's rattled. It means he's willing to escalate." She turned to face him. "How did the conversation go?" He told her. Sutton the signed statement William Marsh in Cheyenne, the full shape of the family operation. He watched her take it in, watched her process the particular detail about the federal clerk with the same contained fury she brought to everything. "His sister's husband," she said, "buried the complaint before Thomas had any chance of being helped through official channels. So Thomas was alone from the start." Her voice was flat. "He found it, he tried to report it, the report disappeared, and then Grayson knew he'd reported it, which told him Thomas had to be silenced. That's the sequence." Clara was quiet for a moment. "How do we reach a judge without going through the Cheyenne circuit? There's a federal circuit judge in Helena, Judge Abernathy. I've worked cases through his court before. He doesn't know William Marsh personally and has no loyalty to the Cheyenne circuit." Nathan paused. "I need to be in Helena by tomorrow morning to file personally, which means I need to ride through the night." Clara looked at him. "That leaves me here alone. Pete Garland will stay close, and you'll have Sutton's statement in hand by tonight, which means if anything happens to you, it becomes the most significant evidence in a federal case." He held her eyes. "Grayson won't touch you while that statement exists, and he doesn't know where it is. Unless he decides to move before you get back. Sunday is 3 days away. I'll be back by Saturday morning." He paused. "I need you to do something while I'm gone." "What?" "Talk to Reverend Grayson." She stared at him. "I know how that sounds," Nathan said. "But hear me. If Grayson is planning to use Sunday service to tell his version of events, first he needs to believe he still has time. If you approach him carefully with exactly the right tone and give him the impression that you're frightened and considering leaving town, you buy us the time we need. He thinks you're running, he relaxes. He relaxes, he doesn't accelerate whatever he's planning." Clara was quiet for a long moment. "You want me to act scared?" she said. "I want you to act like the woman he spent 3 years believing you are," Nathan said. "Not because that woman is who you are, but because it's the most useful performance you could give right now." She looked at him steadily. "I know what I'm asking," he said. "I know what it costs. Do you—" She said it without heat, just as a genuine question turning it over. Then she exhaled slowly. "Yes, I'll go to him. I'll be the frightened, overwhelmed woman he expects. I'll tell him the new ranch hand has been asking me uncomfortable questions about the past, and it's brought everything back, and I'm thinking of taking my mother to my cousin's place in Billings for a while." She paused. "He'll love every word of it." "Yes," Nathan said quietly. "He will." She looked away from him briefly toward the smoldering woodpile. "I hate this." "I know. Not the plan. The fact that it works. The fact that I know exactly how to do it because I've been doing a version of it for 3 years just to survive." She looked back at him, and something in her face was very direct and very tired at the same time. "Being what people expect you to be so they don't hurt you worse. I'm very good at it. I hate that I'm very good at it." Nathan looked at her and said nothing because there was nothing useful he could say. She was right. She had learned to perform smallness as a survival mechanism, and the fact that she could deploy it tactically now did not make its origins any less unjust. "When this is over," he said finally, "you will never have to do it again." She looked at him for a moment. "Make sure it gets over then," she said. He rode to Sutton's house that evening and took the formal statement. Sutton wrote in a small, cramped hand and did not ask for water or breaks and finished in 40 minutes. He signed it without hesitation. His hand was very steady, and Nathan thought that whatever else Roy Sutton was, he had made his decision completely, and was seeing it through with a kind of bleak integrity. "One more thing," Sutton said when Nathan was folding the statement. "The two hired men who were in that alley. One is dead, died 2 years ago fever. The other one is still in the territory. His name is Cal Britton. He works a mine operation near the state line." He looked at Nathan. "He knows everything. He was there from beginning to end. If you can get to him before Grayson does—" "Where near the state line?" "Copper Ridge, the Tilden mine operation north side." Sutton paused. "He's been wanting out for years. He told me so last spring. Grayson has something on him, something from before 1881. But if you come at him right with the right offer, he'll talk." Nathan folded the statement and put it inside his coat. "Thank you," he said, which was not a thing he had expected to say to Roy Sutton. Sutton nodded once, looked at the floor, said nothing. Nathan left. He went to Clara's house one last time before riding out. It was nearly 9 in the evening, and cold enough that their breath showed between them when they stood at her gate. "Sutton gave me a name," he said, and told her about Cal Britton. "If I can reach him before Helena, or route a message through the marshal's office in Copper Ridge." "Go to Helena first," Clara said. "Get the warrant. Nothing works without the warrant." "You'll be all right. I've been all right through significantly worse than 3 days." He looked at her in the dark. There was something he wanted to say, had been wanting to say for days, had been careful not to say because the timing was wrong, and there was too much between them that hadn't been resolved yet. And he was not the kind of man who said things simply because he felt them, without first making sure the moment could hold the weight of them. "Clara, go," she said, not unkindly. "Come back with the warrant. Everything else can wait." He went. She listened to his horse's hoofbeats fade down the road, and then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a while, with a cup of tea. She didn't drink, and she thought about what Nathan had said. "When this is over, you will never have to do it again." She thought about the certainty in it. Not a promise dressed up in uncertainty, a statement. The kind a man makes when he means to stand behind it. She thought about that for longer than was strictly necessary, and then told herself firmly to focus. In the morning, she would go to Grayson. She spent 20 minutes thinking about exactly how she would do it, what she would say, what she would let him see, how much fear she would show, and at what moments how to pitch the request about going to Billings so it sounded like genuine defeat rather than strategy. She had performed this kind of scene many times in her life without choosing to and without understanding it as a performance. Now she understood it exactly. That made it colder, but it also made it better. A woman who knows she's acting has control over the performance in a way that a woman simply surviving does not. Grayson would see what he expected to see. A frightened, beaten-down woman asking for permission to disappear. He would give her the warmth of a man who believes he has won. And while he was warm and comfortable and believing he had won, Nathan Hale would be riding through the night toward Helena with a signed statement in his coat and 5 years of carefully gathered evidence in his notebook. And by Saturday morning, he would come back to Willow Creek with a federal warrant and 2 United States Marshals. And Sunday would go very differently than Reverend Samuel Grayson was planning. She went to bed and slept in the calm, purposeful way of a woman who has been running from something for 3 years and has finally for the first time turned around to face it. Friday morning she dressed carefully, not in the dark wool dress, something softer, more easily read, as anxious as vulnerable. She did her hair simply. She made sure her expression when she practiced it in the window glass showed the right amount of strain. Then she walked to the church. Grayson was in his office. He answered her knock with the smooth, instant warmth of a man who had been told something was coming and had prepared accordingly. "Clara," he said in his Sunday voice, warm, paternal, practiced. "Come in, my dear. I'm glad you came to me." She sat down across from him, and she looked at this man who had ordered Thomas killed, who had destroyed her reputation to protect his money, who had spent 3 years watching her suffer in his church from the security of a pulpit, and she gave him exactly what he wanted. She told him she was frightened, that the stranger's questions had brought everything back, that she was thinking of taking her mother to Billings for the winter, perhaps longer. That she was so tired of all of it, so tired of being associated with trouble, and she just wanted peace. She watched Grayson listen. She watched the particular satisfaction settle over his face as she spoke. The satisfaction of a man who believes the last obstacle has just announced its own removal. He was kind. He was generous. He took her hands in his and told her that sometimes a fresh start was exactly what God intended. That he would pray for her safe travels. That she had always been welcome in his church despite everything, and the door would be open when she was ready to return. She thanked him. She shook his hand. She walked out into the cold Friday morning down the church steps and onto the main road, and she kept her face composed and her pace steady until she was around the corner and out of sight. Then she stopped. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the effort of sitting in that room, of touching that man's hand, of watching that satisfaction move over his face, while Thomas Aldridge's note was folded inside her coat, and 3 families' stolen land records were sitting in Harold Briggs's office, and Roy Sutton's signed statement was riding north toward Helena in Nathan Hale's inside pocket. She breathed through it. In and out. Once, twice. Then she straightened up and walked home. 2 days. Just 2 more days. She was 3 houses from her own door when she heard her name called from behind her, and this time the voice was not Sutton and not Margaret, and not any voice she had been braced for. It was a woman she barely knew. Alice Doyle, the banker's wife, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, who had never spoken directly to Clara in 3 years. "Miss Whitmore," Alice said. "A moment, if you please." Clara stopped, turned, waited. "I want you to know," Alice said in a low, precise voice, looking at Clara with an expression that was somewhere between discomfort and determination, "that my husband did not want to foreclose on the Garland property in 1881. He was pressured to accelerate the timeline by the church." She paused. "He's been uncomfortable with it ever since. If there is ever—" She stopped, rephrased. "If someone were looking for a bank officer willing to speak to certain irregularities in the loan processing from that period, my husband would not be opposed to a private conversation." Clara looked at her. The walls of Grayson's carefully constructed world were developing cracks from every direction now. Sutton, Margaret, Pete Garland, Alice Doyle's husband at the bank. People who had been quiet for 3 years out of fear or complicity or simple self-preservation, and who were starting to feel one by one the particular shift in the air that came when the balance began to tip. "Tell your husband," Clara said carefully, "to be available Saturday afternoon." Alice Doyle nodded once briskly and walked away. Clara went home. She sat with her mother, who was having a better day than usual, color in her face alert and funny, and asking about the chickens and the frost, and whether the Emmett girl had finally married that young man from the hardware store. Clara answered everything patiently, warmly, with the full attention she gave her mother whenever she could. Edna looked at her daughter across the table with the look she had worn since Tuesday, the careful, watchful look of a woman who knew something was happening and had decided to trust her daughter with it, rather than ask questions that might make things harder. "You're all right," Edna said, not a question. "I'm all right, Mama." "And that man, the cowboy." Clara looked at her. "He's working on something," Clara said. "He'll be back Saturday." Edna nodded slowly. "He sat beside you," she said. "First Sunday he was here, he sat right down beside you without a second's hesitation." She paused. "I heard about it from Mrs. Briggs. She said the whole church went quiet." A small smile moved across her face. "I've been praying for someone to do that for 3 years." Clara looked at her hands for a moment. "Don't read too much into it, Mama." "I'm not reading anything into it," Edna said serenely. "I'm just saying what happened." Clara did not answer, but she sat there at the kitchen table in the late afternoon light with her hands around her teacup, and she allowed herself very briefly to think about a man riding north through a November night with 5 years of justice in his coat pocket, and what it meant that he had chosen on his very first Sunday in Willow Creek, before he knew whether she'd help him, before he knew whether she'd trust him, to walk into a full church and sit down beside the one woman everyone else had decided not to see. Not as strategy. She'd asked herself whether it was strategy, and she'd turned it over carefully from every angle, and she kept arriving at the same answer. He had simply decided she deserved to have someone sit beside her, and that after everything was the thing that was hardest to hold steady against. She tightened her hands around her cup, looked out the window at the November sky, and waited for Saturday. Nathan rode back into Willow Creek on Saturday morning, with mud on his coat, exhaustion in every line of his face, and a federal warrant signed by Judge Abernathy of the Helena Circuit folded flat inside his vest alongside Roy Sutton's statement, and a second sworn affidavit from Cal Britton, the man from the alley, the last living witness to what had happened to Thomas Aldridge, who had been found at the Tilden mine operation, who had taken exactly 40 minutes to decide that 5 years of Grayson's quiet threat was a lighter burden than what Nathan was laying in front of him. Clara was at the gate when he arrived, as though she had been listening for his horse for the last hour, and had simply stepped outside at the right moment. She looked at his face. He nodded once. She closed her eyes briefly. Opened them. "Come inside," she said. He sat at her kitchen table and laid out everything. The warrant, Sutton's statement, Britton's affidavit, and the documentation from Judge Abernathy authorizing 2 deputy marshals who were currently riding from Helena and would arrive in Willow Creek by Sunday mid-morning. He also laid down one more document, which he hadn't mentioned yet, because he had only received it Friday afternoon at the Helena office, when a wire had arrived from a federal investigator in St. Louis. "Eliza Calloway," he said. "Grayson's sister. The federal office in St. Louis executed a financial examination order Friday morning. Her accounts are frozen pending investigation." He paused. She also, under examination, gave a voluntary statement. Apparently, she had been under the impression that the money was from legitimate church fundraising operations. When the investigator showed her the actual source, she cooperated fully. Clara stared at him. "She didn't know," Clara said. "She knew the money came from her brother. She didn't know what it was built on." Nathan paused. "It doesn't absolve the financial complicity, but it means Grayson was deceiving his own family as well as his congregation." Clara was quiet for a moment, processing the particular shape of that a man so practiced at constructing the appearance of righteousness that he had managed it even with his own blood. "What about William Marsh in Cheyenne?" she said. "The circuit clerk. Suspended pending investigation as of Friday afternoon. He cannot bury anything else." Nathan looked at her steadily. "It's done, Clara. The architecture of it is down. Tomorrow, it becomes public." She put both hands flat on the table, looked at them. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow. Grayson is planning to use Sunday service to tell his version first. We let him start. We let him get comfortable. And then we walk in." He paused. "I need to know you're ready for what that room is going to look like." She looked up at him. "That room has been looking at me a certain way for 3 years. It can look at me a different way tomorrow." Nathan looked at her. This woman who had spent 3 years being made small by a room full of people who chose a comfortable lie over an inconvenient truth. And he thought that whatever tomorrow brought, whatever that church looked like when the morning was over, Clara Whitmore had already won something that no warrant and no judge could have given her. She had not broken. That was the whole of it. "There's one more thing," he said. He reached into his coat and laid Thomas's note on the table between them. She had known about it since he told her in part 2. She had not asked to see it. He had not offered it, understanding in the way he understood her by now that she would ask for it when she was ready and not before. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked it up and read it. He watched her face while she read. He watched the careful steadiness of it, the controlled quality she brought to everything, and he watched the moment when something underneath that steadiness moved. Brief, precise, completely private. Her eyes didn't change. Her hands didn't shake. But something passed through her that was between grief and release, and a kind of terrible tenderness for the man who had written 6 lines in fear for his life, and spent 2 of them making sure she knew it wasn't her fault. She folded the note, held it for a moment. "Thank you for bringing it back to me," she said. It always belonged to you, Nathan said. She set it down carefully, stood, and went to the window. My mother will need to stay with Margaret Teller during the service tomorrow. I don't want her in that church when it happens. I'll arrange it. And Pete Garland. Pete knows. He'll be there. She turned around. What time do the marshals arrive? Between 9 and 10. Service starts at 10. I know. She nodded slowly. Something was working in her face, not fear, but the quality of a person mentally walking through every step of a thing before committing to it, checking each foothold before trusting her weight to it. Clara, he said. She looked at him. Whatever happens in that church tomorrow, whatever people say, however the room reacts, I will be standing right beside you. The whole way through. He paused. Not because you need me to be. You've made it very clear you can stand on your own. But because... He stopped. Started again. Because I should have been standing beside you 5 years ago in that alley, when there was still time to make a different choice. I can't give that back. But I can give you tomorrow. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at him for a long moment with those direct measuring eyes that had over the course of 1 week learned to see him with less suspicion and more of something else that neither of them had put a name to yet. You've been giving me more than tomorrow, she said quietly. Since Sunday morning. He didn't say anything. She turned back to the window. Go get some sleep, Nathan. You've been riding for 2 days. He slept 4 hours in the room above the feed store and was up before first light. Sunday came in cold and clear. The 2 deputy marshals from Helena, names of Briggs and Calloway, no relation to anyone in the story, which Nathan noted with the flat irony of a man who had been doing this work long enough to stop being surprised by coincidence, arrived at 9:30, reviewed the warrant and supporting documents in 20 minutes, and positioned themselves at Nathan's direction without requiring explanation. They were professional men who understood what they'd been handed and moved accordingly. At 9:45, Pete Garland walked into the church and took a seat in the middle of the congregation. He was a large, weathered man, whom half the room recognized as a ranch hand, and half did not recognize at all. And he sat with the contained stillness of someone who had been waiting for this specific morning for a considerable portion of his adult life. At 9:50, Roy Sutton entered the church. Several heads turned. Sutton was always early to service, reliable, punctual, the picture of conscientious devotion. He took his usual seat at the front. He did not look at anyone in particular. His face was the face of a man who has made a decision and is living inside it. Reverend Grayson took the pulpit at 10 o'clock, exactly silver-haired, and certain with the ease of a man in complete command of his room. He opened with a scripture, delivered it warmly. Let the room settle into the particular comfortable rhythm of a Sunday morning it had known for 20 years. Then he cleared his throat. Before we proceed with today's message, he said, I feel called to address something that has been troubling members of our community this week. It is never pleasant to speak of such things from this pulpit, but a shepherd who stays silent while wolves circle his flock is no shepherd at all. The room gave him its full attention. That was what the room always did. There is a man in our midst, Grayson said, his voice settling into the measured gravity of a man delivering difficult truth, who has been spreading falsehoods about the history of this community, asking questions designed to reopen old wounds, using a troubled woman's grief and isolation to... The church doors opened. Nathan walked in. He walked down the center aisle with the 2 deputy marshals 1 step behind him, and the room went so still that the sound of his boots on the wooden floor was the only sound in the building. He walked without hurrying, without any of the performed drama of a man who wanted to be watched, simply the direct forward movement of a man going to the place he needed to be. Grayson stopped mid-sentence. In the 3 seconds before anyone spoke, Nathan saw the room as one sees it in those moments of absolute clarity. Every face turned toward him. The particular frozen quality of a congregation watching something walk through their door that they do not have a category for. He saw Daniel Grayson in the 3rd row go pale in a way that was visible from 20 feet. He saw Roy Sutton in the front pew staring straight ahead, hands flat on his knees. And then the door opened again. Clara walked in. She walked in alone, without anyone beside her, in the dark wool dress she wore every Sunday, with her hair pinned simply and her chin level and her eyes forward. She walked to the third pew from the back left side, the same pew she had sat in alone for 3 years, and she sat down. She did not look at anyone. She did not perform anything. She simply sat. And the room that had watched her arrive every Sunday and watched her leave and never once offered her the basic dignity of acknowledgement, looked at her now with the particular discomfort of people who are beginning to understand, before a single word has been said, that something is about to be irrevocable. "Reverend Grayson," Nathan said from the foot of the pulpit steps, in a voice that was clear and carried without effort to every corner of the room. "I am Deputy Marshal Nathan Hale, Federal Circuit, operating under warrant issued by Judge Abernathy of the Helena Court. I am here to place you under arrest on charges of fraud conspiracy, land theft, coercion of federal witnesses, and complicity in the murder of Thomas Aldridge in May of 1881. The room erupted, not in a single direction, in every direction. A sound composed of gasps and voices, and at least 2 women who stood up simultaneously, and a man in the back who shouted something that was swallowed by the noise before it resolved into words. Daniel Grayson was on his feet. 3 deacons were on their feet. The sound kept building. Grayson raised one hand. The room did not go quiet for Nathan. It went quiet for Grayson. That was the particular power the man had built over 30 years, and Nathan had counted on it, because what Grayson was about to say needed to be heard clearly. "This man," Grayson said in a voice shaking with controlled outrage, "is an outsider. He came to this town with an agenda, using a troubled woman who has always—" "The agenda is this," Nathan said, and placed Thomas's note on the front pew railing where the nearest members of the congregation could see it. A note written by Thomas Aldridge before he died, identifying Samuel Grayson's land fraud scheme. Corroborated by the signed statement of Roy Sutton, who was present when Reverend Grayson ordered Thomas's death. He placed the statement beside the note. And by the sworn affidavit of Calvin Britton, who was in that alley the night it happened, and who has identified Daniel Grayson as one of the men present. Daniel Grayson made a sound. "Furthermore," Nathan said, "the land records of this county on file with Recorder Harold Briggs document 3 fraudulent property seizures in the months following the robbery, transferred through a holding company registered in Roy Sutton's name, to an account held by Eliza Calloway, Samuel Grayson's sister, in St. Louis. Those accounts are now frozen under federal order." The congregation was no longer making noise. The congregation was sitting in the particular silence of people who are being handed something they cannot return. Grayson looked at his room. For the first time in the years Nathan had been building this case, he watched the man look at his room and find it looking back with something other than unconditional belief. He watched it happen in real time, the slow, terrible recognition in Grayson's face of a man who has bet everything on the loyalty of people he has never actually loved and is seeing the bet come up short. "This is fabricated," Grayson said, still confident, still the voice of a man who had never once been successfully challenged in this room. "Roy Sutton is a man under pressure who will say anything to— The records are real, Reverend." This voice was Harold Briggs, who had risen from a middle pew with the quiet authority of a man who has been tending facts for 40 years and has chosen this morning to let them speak. "I have them. I've had them since 1881. I can account for every transaction on record." Grayson turned toward him. "And I have something else," said a voice from the back. Alice Doyle's husband, Lawrence the bank officer, was standing. His voice was not steady. It was the voice of a man doing something that frightened him, but it was loud. "The bank was pressured to accelerate the Garland foreclosure. I have the correspondence. It came from the church office. From your desk, Reverend. I kept copies because something about it felt wrong, and I didn't know what to do with them, and I have been sitting on them for 5 years, and I am done sitting." The room shifted in a way that was physical. The way a room shifts when the weight of something has crossed a tipping point and cannot come back. He framed her. This was Margaret Teller standing in the 5th pew, her voice shaking but her eyes dry. He arranged the witnesses, I was one of them. I was coerced into that testimony by Roy Sutton on Samuel Grayson's instruction. I am saying so now in this room in front of everyone, because I should have said so 3 years ago, and I did not, and I have to live with that." She turned and looked directly at Clara across the rows of pews. "I am sorry, Clara. I am so sorry." Clara looked at her. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Whatever Margaret needed from her in this moment, the most honest thing Clara could offer was the truth of her own face, which showed neither forgiveness nor condemnation. Only the simple hard-edged acknowledgement of one woman looking at another and saying without words, "I know. I know what it cost you to stay silent, and I know what it cost you to speak, and I see you." Margaret Teller sat down and put her face in her hands. Daniel Grayson moved. He was up from his pew and moving toward the side door before anyone had quite processed the intention, and the deputy marshal nearest that door was already positioned because Nathan had positioned him there, specifically because Daniel Grayson was the kind of man who ran when cornered, and Nathan had learned this about him 2 years ago. The deputy caught him by the arm at the door. Daniel swung. The deputy was larger and steadier and had done this before, and the struggle lasted approximately 4 seconds before Daniel was against the wall with his arms held, and the room watching in the dazed, uncomprehending way of people watching something they cannot quite believe is real. Samuel Grayson did not run. Not. He stood at his pulpit, and he looked at his congregation, and he understood, in whatever passes for understanding, in a man like him, that the room he had built over 30 years was standing inside the ruins of itself. He looked at Roy Sutton, who did not look back. He looked at the documents on the pew railing. He looked at Nathan. And then, in the last performance of a man who had spent his life performing, he bowed his head. He said nothing, just bowed it. Nathan took him by the arm and walked him out of the church. The deputy marshals walked Daniel Grayson out behind him. The room was completely silent. In the third pew from the back, Clara Whitmore sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her spine straight, and her eyes forward the way she had sat every Sunday for 3 years. Only now, the silence around her was not the silence of a room looking away. It was the silence of a room that did not know where to look, because looking at Clara Whitmore required looking at itself, and what it saw when it looked at itself was a community that had chosen comfort over truth for 3 years and had called it righteousness. An older woman in the front row began to cry, quietly, without drama. Pete Garland walked from the middle of the congregation to the third pew from the back and sat down beside Clara on her left. Lawrence Doyle, the bank officer, walked down the aisle and sat on her right. Harold Briggs got up from his pew and found a seat 2 rows ahead and turned around to look at her once briefly with the look of a man who had been waiting for the room to catch up with the truth and was relieved to have lived to see it. One by one, in the uncertain, halting way of people doing something they should have done years ago and cannot do gracefully because grace requires practice. The congregation rearranged itself around the woman who had been sitting alone in that pew for 3 years. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say that the movement itself didn't say more honestly. Clara looked straight ahead. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were dry. She was the same woman who had walked into this church 3 years ago and every Sunday since, and she was also entirely different, not because anything in her had changed, but because the room had finally caught up to who she had always been. After a long time, she heard boots on the wooden floor behind her. Nathan sat down beside her. He didn't say anything. He sat, the way he had sat that first Sunday with his hat on his knee. His forearms easy, his presence completely unhurried like a man who had nowhere else to be and needed no permission to be here. Clara looked at him. "The warrant went through," she said. "Completely. Grayson Daniel William Marsh in Cheyenne, the St. Louis account." He paused. "It's done." She was quiet. "Thomas's name will be cleared," Nathan said. "Formally, on record." He paused again. "It won't bring him back." "No," she said. "It won't." She looked at the front of the church at the pulpit where a man had stood for 30 years and built an empire of lies in the shape of a sermon. But it gives him back his truth. He tried to do the right thing, and it killed him. He deserves to have that on record. He deserves to be remembered correctly." "He does," Nathan said. The silence between them was the easy kind now, the kind that had earned itself. "What happens to you?" Clara asked. "When this closes, the case is done. Do you go back to Cheyenne?" Nathan looked at her. "I have to file the final reports," he said. "Testify at the proceedings. The case will take months to work through the court." He paused. "Helena Circuit, which means I'd be based somewhere in the territory." "Somewhere in the territory," Clara said. "Ideally somewhere with a decent livery and a county recorder who keeps good files." She looked at him. Something moved in her face, not quite a smile, but the thing that lives one layer beneath a smile, in the place where a woman keeps the things she's not ready to say aloud, but has stopped pretending she doesn't feel. "That description applies to Willow Creek," she said. "It does," he said. She looked forward again. Around them, the congregation had begun to move, some toward the door, some in quiet clusters, the low murmur of a community beginning the long and uncomfortable work of reckoning with itself. It would not be clean. It would not be quick. 3 years of collective cruelty did not resolve itself in a single Sunday morning, and Clara knew that better than anyone. There would be people in this town who resented her for the disruption, who found ways to hold the old story close, because releasing it meant releasing their own part in it. There would be Sundays ahead that were still hard, but the pew would not be empty beside her. That was what had changed. The pew would not be empty. "Nathan," she said. "Clara. The next time you decide to sit down next to a woman the whole town is ignoring," she said, "make sure you have a very good reason." "I had the best reason I know," he said. She deserved to have someone sit beside her. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over without ceremony, without hesitation, and took his hand. She did not look in the room when she did it. She did not check who was watching, did not calculate the risk, did not perform the old survival math of a woman who had spent 3 years managing other people's perceptions of her. She simply took his hand because she wanted to, and because she had earned the right to want things without apology, and because the man sitting beside her had ridden through a November night and stood in a hostile church and placed the truth on a railing in front of 30 people who did not want to see it. And he had done all of it, not for glory, not for the case, but because one wrong choice in an alley 5 years ago had never stopped costing him a single night's sleep. Nobody in the church whispered. Not one person. The silence that fell over the room when Clara Whitmore took Nathan Hale's hand in the third pew from the back was not the silence of shock or disapproval. It was the silence of a community that had just been shown plainly and without mercy the difference between the judgment it had practiced and the grace it had failed to offer, and was sitting inside that difference and feeling its weight for the first time. The church bells rang at 11 o'clock the way they rang every Sunday, carrying out over the valley and the creek and the frost-covered hills of Montana Territory, the same as they always had. Only now the woman who had sat alone beneath those bells for 3 years was sitting with her hand held and her chin level and her name clean, and the man beside her was not going anywhere. And the pew that had been left empty by every coward and every small cruelty and every comfortable lie Willow Creek had ever told itself was full. Thomas Aldridge had written 6 lines in fear and darkness, and spent 2 of them making sure Clara Whitmore knew she was not to blame. And 3 years later in the church where his killer had preached righteousness every Sunday morning, the truth he had died trying to tell was finally standing in the light where it had always belonged, where it could finally do what truth is supposed to do when you stop being afraid of it. It set her free.